Montana Territory. 1883. The wind carried the scent of pine and dust through the cracked window panes of the Gold Lantern Saloon in the town of Bitter Creek. Pearl Donnelly stood behind the long oak bar, wiping a glass that was already clean, her back aching from too many years bent under the weight of stares and laughter. Her once golden curls now held more silver than she cared to admit, and the rouge on her cheeks could no longer hide the lines time had etched into her skin. The piano played its tired tune in the corner, and the men cowboys, miners, grifters watched her with the kind of grin that came from knowing she was no longer the girl they remembered, that she had stayed too long, that the saloon girl had aged. A burst of laughter erupted near the far table. "That old hen still thinks she can turn heads," one man said, loud enough for half the room to hear. Pearl kept her face steady as she poured a whiskey and slid it down the bar. "That hen still has ears," she said, voice flat. The man chuckled, not the least bit ashamed. Another added, "She'll be sweeping up after the next girl in a year." Pearl didn't flinch. She had heard worse, but it still settled like a stone in her chest. She stepped outside for a breath of air, gripping the railing of the porch to steady herself. The street was quiet, save for the clop of hooves in the distance and the creak of signs swaying in the breeze. Her knuckles were white against the wood. She had been 16 when she first arrived in Bitter Creek. She had danced when her knees were still strong, smiled when her heart still believed in someday. Now she was 39 and someday never came. "Pearl!" A deep voice called from the boardwalk. She turned. The man sitting on the edge of the bench by the mercantile stood and stepped into the lamplight. He wore a trail-worn hat and a thick canvas duster with the collar turned up. Dust clung to his boots and his horse stood tied nearby, chewing on oats. "Yate Nolan," she said, surprised. "I thought you were down near the Ruby River." "I was," he gave a small nod. "Ranch work dried up, figured I'd ride north." Pearl blinked. "You look older," Yate chuckled. "So do you," she laughed, genuinely for the first time in days. "Well, that is honest." He stepped closer, hands tucked into his coat. "You still workin' in the saloon?" Still standing behind the bar, barely. Yate glanced through the saloon window and saw the men inside, the way they leaned back with their boots up, spitting tobacco and laughing too loud. "I would sit a spell if you'll let me," he said. Pearl nodded and walked down the steps beside him. They sat on the edge of the boardwalk, looking out over the quiet street. For a while neither spoke. "You remember the creek south of here?" he asked finally. "Where the cottonwoods grow wild?" "Of course, you used to carve your name into every tree. And you used to yell at me for it," he said, smiling. "I still would." Yate's eyes turned serious. "You were always the one with more sense." She looked at him, then really looked. His jaw was stronger, the lines around his eyes deeper, but the same calm strength was there. They had been 18 when they kissed under those cottonwoods. He had promised to return, but like most boys with a horse, he had ridden on. Pearl exhaled. "What brings you back after all these years?" He looked at her with something warm in his eyes. "I never forgot you, and I heard what folks been saying. About you getting older, about how they treat you. I figured maybe it was time someone stood up for you." Pearl blinked hard. "I do not need saving, Yate. I know," he said gently. "But maybe you deserve more than just surviving." Before she could answer, a scream came from the alley behind the saloon. Pearl shot to her feet. That sounded like Orla. She ran, Yate on her heels. Behind the saloon, near the stacked crates and empty barrels, a small girl no older than 6 was curled against the wall, her face streaked with dust and tears. "Mama!" she cried. Pearl dropped to her knees and pulled the girl into her arms. Yate stood over them, his voice low. "Yours?" Pearl nodded. "She and her brother. Their father left when the boy turned 1. I have been raising them alone. A boy, maybe 8 years old, peeked from behind a broken fence post. Come here, Owen, Yate said, crouching to meet his eyes. The boy hesitated, then walked slowly over. Pearl held Orla close, brushing dirt from her cheeks. What happened? Some man grabbed me, Orla sobbed, but I kicked him and ran. Yate's face darkened. Did you see who? Owen spoke up. He had a scar on his neck, I saw it. Yate stood, his jaw set. Stay with them. I will find him. No, Pearl said, standing. You do not need to get involved. But he was already walking, his hand resting near the revolver on his hip. Pearl watched him go, heart pounding. It had been years since anyone stood between her and danger. Years since someone looked at her like she mattered. Back inside the saloon, Pearl sat with her children at an empty table, arms wrapped around them. Yate returned an hour later, quiet and calm. He is gone, he said simply. Pearl looked up. Gone? He will not be coming back to Bitter Creek. I made sure of it. She stared at him for a long moment, then rose and walked to him. Her voice was low. You did not have to do that. I know, he said, his eyes soft on hers. But I wanted to. She nodded, her throat tight. You are different than I remember. So are you, he said. Stronger than anyone I know. Pearl looked away, blinking hard. They all think I stayed too long, that I should be ashamed of what I became. He stepped closer. They are fools. You raised 2 children alone, kept working when the world tried to wear you down. You are the strongest woman I know, Pearl Donnelly. Her breath caught. And then, for the first time in years, she let someone hold her. The saloon kept playing its tired song, but outside the storm had passed, and the stars cut through the sky like silver promises. Morning came soft and gray over Bitter Creek, the air damp with spring melt and the low murmur of wagons beginning their day's haul. Pearl stood at the stove in the small room above the saloon, sleeves rolled and her apron faintly dusted with flour. Owen sat at the table, carving a piece of pine with his jackknife, while Orla folded scraps of fabric into makeshift dolls, her fingers clumsy but determined. She turned the bannock with the edge of a fork, its crust browning evenly. The pan hissed low in the quiet. Her hands moved out of habit, but her mind was elsewhere on the man who'd walked into town after years gone and sat beside her like he'd never left. Behind her, boots creaked on the stairs. I didn't expect you this early, she said, not turning. I figured I'd bring the mare around for Owen to look at, Yate said as he stepped into the room, removing his hat. She's got a limp in her left foreleg. Thought he might have a better eye than me. Owen's gaze flicked up, cautious. I could try. Pearl set a plate in front of the boy, then another across from him. She looked at Yate over her shoulder. You'll stay for breakfast then. I will, he said, pulling out the chair without waiting for her to insist. They ate quietly at first, just the scrape of forks and the occasional rustle of Orla's doll cloth. When Owen pushed back his plate, Yate leaned toward him. You ever handled a hoof file? Owen nodded. Mr. Barlow at the livery showed me last fall. Said I've got a good touch. Then I reckon you'll know what to do once you see her walk. Pearl stood by the window, drying her hands on a rag. You offering him work, if he's willing, Yate said. I've got a small place near the hills west of town. It ain't much, but it's quiet. Could use a few hands come planting. Owen looked to his mother, uncertain. Pearl's mouth parted slightly, but she said nothing at first. Then, you plan on staying then? He met her eyes. If I've got reason to. Orla tugged at Pearl's skirt. Can we see the horse? Pearl nodded. Coat first. While the children dressed, Pearl walked with Yate to the landing, her voice low. They've never had a man they could count on. Not really. I'm not in the habit of making promises I can't keep, he said. She watched his face, searching. And if they grow to care for you, then I'd be a fool to leave. Outside, the frost had lifted and the dirt streets glistened beneath the thaw. The mare stood tied near the well, head low, tail swishing lazily. Owen circled her, crouching now and then, touching her leg with a steadiness that belied his age. Yate leaned against the fence, arms crossed. "He's got the start of a good hand." "He'll be 13 next month," Pearl said softly. "He carries more than he should." Yate glanced at her, then back at the boy. "You taught them to stand on their own." "I had to," he nodded. "But maybe now you don't have to do it alone." Pearl looked at him, her brow tight. "I don't know what I'd even be, not doing everything alone. Maybe just yourself." She was quiet a long time, watching her son lead the mare forward with careful steps. Then she said, "You still have that old fiddle?" Yate's eyes warmed with surprise. "I do. You used to play it like the notes were part of you. I haven't touched it in years." "You should," she said, and then added, "The children have never heard live music, not once." He studied her, the morning light softening the sharp lines of her face. "I'll bring it by tonight." "If you'll let me." Pearl gave a small nod, then turned back to the children. "Orla, don't pull her tail. I'm just looking," the girl said, both hands behind her back. Yate chuckled, then caught himself and turned it into a cough. "She's got your fire." "She has her own," Pearl said. Later that evening, the lanterns glowed behind the saloon's frosted windows. Pearl carried a crate of tinned peaches from the storeroom, her arms aching. She paused when she heard the first notes float down the stairs, low and warm, the kind of sound that bent time and pulled something deep from the chest. The fiddle had a voice like evening wind through tall grass. She climbed slowly, pushing open the door to the upstairs room. Yate sat near the hearth, the fire crackling low beside him. Orla lay curled on a blanket, her eyes fluttering closed. Owen leaned against the wall in the corner, his breathing slow and steady. He stopped playing when he saw her. "You remembered the tune," she said, his mouth lifted. "I never forgot it." Pearl stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The fiddle rested against his knee, his fingers still curled around the neck. "I don't know what this is," she said, voice quiet. "You showing up after all this time, helping. Playing music for my children. I'm not trying to be anything you haven't asked for," he said. "But if there's space in your life, Pearl, I'd like to fill it." She knelt by the hearth, the firelight catching the edge of her jaw. "I don't trust easily anymore. I don't expect you to. But I remember the boy who carved his name into trees," she said. "He was reckless and full of hope, and I remember wishing he'd stay. I'm not a boy anymore," he said. "And this time, I'm not leaving." She looked at him then, truly looked, the lines and the years between them like threads woven into something steady. Her voice barely rose above the fire. "Then stay." He set the fiddle down, crossed to her, and took her hand. No declarations, no promises written in air, just the quiet press of calloused fingers around hers, and the long, silent echo of something beginning again. Outside, the wind had calmed, and the streets of Bitter Creek lay still beneath the stars. By mid-May, the snowmelt had turned the banks of Bitter Creek thick with mud, and the cottonwoods along the edge of town had begun to leaf out, their branches soft with green. Pearl stood outside the boarding house with a basket of linens, her fingers red from scrubbing. The sun was climbing steady over the rooftops, and the scent of river silt hung on the breeze. From down the road, Yate approached on foot, his sleeves rolled and a sack slung over one shoulder. His boots were caked from the walk-in from the edge of his land. "You look like you've been wrestling hogs," Pearl said, setting the basket on the bench beside her. "I chased a mule through a dry wash for half the morning," he said, brushing grit from his trousers. "Got the fence mended, though, mostly." She narrowed her eyes. "You've taken to cursing under your breath when you lie." "I'll work on that," he said, and handed her the sack. "Brought cornmeal and a bit of sorghum. Thought you might put it to use." Pearl lifted the sack with a nod, then opened the door and motioned him inside. The boarding house kitchen was cool and dim, the windows thrown wide to catch the cross breeze. She set the cornmeal on the counter beside a crock of beans soaking from the night before. "You always bring things?" she asked, not turning. "Only when I've got something worth giving," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. Pearl pulled a tin of lard from the shelf and glanced at him. "You planning to eat here or just drop off supplies like a peddler? I could be persuaded to sit a spell." She handed him a knife and a gourd from the sideboard. "Then peel that." "I'm not making stew alone." He took the blade without hesitation and began slicing the skin off in long, careful strokes. The scrape of steel against gourd echoed in the quiet. After a while, Pearl said, "Owen's been waking early. He walks the edge of your pasture before chores." "I've seen him," Yate said. "He's got quiet steps, keeps his eyes sharp. He's watching the deer. I think he wants to trap, though I've told him it's no trade worth chasing. I've got a book on prairie game, I'll bring it over. He can rate it if he likes." Pearl stirred the beans her back to him. "That'd be kind." Yates set the knife down. "You ever think about leaving town?" She turned then, brow lifting. "Leaving Bitter Creek? I've got more land than I can manage. A house half built. It's nothing fine, but the roof holds and there's a spring nearby. Just thought," he paused. "Well, I thought maybe you and the children might like space to breathe." Pearl leaned on the counter, arms crossed. "You're asking me to move in?" "I'm asking you to choose something that's yours," he said. "Not the saloon, not this borrowed room, a place where nobody's watching to see if you fall." She said nothing for a long time. The wind moved through the window, lifting the lace fringe of the curtain. Finally, she said, "I don't know what I'd do on open land. Cook, tend the garden, sit with your feet in the creek, whatever you damn well please." Pearl's eyes softened, but her voice stayed even. "I'd need a stove, one that doesn't burn too hot on the left side." "I've got one," Yates said. "It's ugly, but it bakes through." She picked up the peeled gourd and sliced it into wedges. "Orla'll need a bed. She kicks in her sleep. Owen wants a loft. I'll build both." Pearl looked down at her hands, the lines across her knuckles pale against her skin. "I never thought I'd be offered something like this." Yates stepped beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth off his arm. "You were never meant to be someone's afterthought. You've carried too much for too long. Let me carry some of it." She turned toward him, slow and steady. "I don't know how to be with someone who stays." "Then we'll learn together." He reached behind her to the shelf and took down a tin cup, filling it from the pump beside the sink. He handed it to her, and she drank without a word. Later, as the stew simmered low and the children returned from their errands, Pearl stepped out onto the porch while Yate helped Owen stack kindling behind the house. Orla came to her side, tugging her sleeve. "Mama, are we going to live where the deer are?" Pearl looked down at her daughter, hair tangled and cheeks sun-flushed. "Would you like that?" "There's more sky out there," Orla said, staring toward the hills. "It feels bigger." Pearl lifted her hand to brush the girl's hair back. "Then maybe it's time we made a life with more sky." Behind her, Yates' voice rose in quiet instruction as he showed Owen how to split a knot of wood without splintering it. The boy listened, nodding, hands steady on the axe. Pearl stepped down from the porch and crossed the yard. She met Yates' gaze, and for once there was no weight behind her eyes, only decision. "We'll come," she said, "but I'm bringing my skillet. It's heavy as sin." Yates' mouth curved. "I wouldn't want it any other way." That night, as dusk settled and the frogs began to call from the creek, Pearl packed the first of their things. Not everything would fit, but she didn't mind. The life ahead would be built slow, with hands she trusted and hearts that had learned how to endure. And this time, she'd walk into it standing tall, loved, chosen, and finally, at peace. The wagon creaked beneath its load as it rolled along the narrow trail west of Bitter Creek. Pearl sat on the seat beside Yate, her hair wrapped in a scarf against the wind, the road rising and falling through stands of willow and alder. Orla dozed in the back, curled between two quilts, and Owen rode behind on the chestnut mare, reins loose in his hands. The hills widened as they climbed, high grass swaying at their edges. They passed no one. Only a pair of mule deer lifted their heads from the brush and watched them go. Yate pointed to a break in the trees ahead. "We're close now." After another mile, the land opened into a shallow basin ringed by cottonwoods. A small cabin stood near the far curve of the slope, with smoke curling faintly from its chimney and a line of stones marking a path to the door. The roof bore fresh shingles, uneven but solid, and a coop sat to one side, half-built. Pearl didn't speak, but her eyes moved over every corner of the place the way the fence hugged the rise of the hill, the neat stack of split wood near the shed, the narrow strip where green shoots pressed up from the earth. Yates stopped the wagon and dismounted. "It ain't finished, but it's got a good start." Owen swung down and walked toward the porch, brushing his hand along the railing. Orla stirred in the back and blinked sleepily. "Where are we?" she mumbled. Pearl turned and tucked a blanket around her. "Home if we want it." Yate opened the cabin door. "Come see." Inside, the single room was swept clean, the floor newly laid with wide pine planks. A cast iron stove stood against the wall, its belly warm. Two cots were set up in the corner, with folded quilts and a tin basin between them. A rough shelf held a few books, a lantern, and a battered tin of salt. Yate set down his hat. "I built the walls thicker than most, wanted it to hold heat when the wind comes down from the pass." Pearl stepped inside and touched the frame of the window. "It's quiet. Only the wind and creek," he said. "No drunks yelling past midnight, no card tables." Owen stood near the stove. "Can I sleep in the loft?" Yate nodded toward the ladder tucked behind the door. "Go see." The boy climbed quickly, boots thudding against the rungs. Orla followed, her bare feet quick and light. Pearl turned in a slow circle, taking in the space. "You did all this yourself?" "Most of it. A ranch hand helped with the roof." "But the rest," he looked at her, his voice steady. "I built with the thought of someone else filling it." Pearl walked to the shelf and ran her fingers over the spine of a book. "You always raid." "When I could, it helped being out here. Gave the silence shape." She glanced at him. "You ever get tired of the quiet?" "I did, but I never wanted to fill it with noise, just something worth listening to." Orla's voice drifted down from the loft. "Mama, there's a window up here." Pearl smiled faintly. "They'll fit." "I want them to," Yates said. She turned to him. "And me?" He stepped closer, slow. "You're already here, Pearl." She looked up at him, the late light catching the copper strands still threaded through her hair. Her voice, when it came, was softer than she meant it. "I never thought I'd be wanted past a certain age." "Past usefulness." He shook his head. "You're not past anything. You're just beginning again." They stood quietly, the air between them warm with something unspoken and sure. Then Pearl reached for his hand. "You'll need someone to keep the stove from burning your biscuits." "I was hoping you'd say that." That evening, after the sun dipped behind the ridge, Owen helped Yate patch a loose board on the coop while Pearl and Orla shelled beans by lantern light. The air smelled of juniper and wood smoke. No music played, no laughter echoed from a saloon. But the peace that settled over the cabin was deep and rooted, like something too long held at bay finally finding its place. Pearl washed the last of the dishes and dried her hands on her apron. When Yates stepped inside, shaking dust from his sleeves, she met his eyes. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll start planting." He nodded. "There's a good stretch of earth behind the shed, rich soil, needs a woman's hand." Pearl crossed the room and touched his chest just above his heart. "You've got one now." He covered her hand with his own. "And I'll keep it if you'll let me." The wind picked up outside, rustling the cottonwoods. Inside, the fire held steady, and for the first time in years, Pearl felt no need to brace herself against the world. It had already given her all she needed. The last frost broke in early June, and the air turned warm enough to leave the door open without pulling a shawl tight across the shoulders. Pearl rose before the sun now, her hands deep in the basin before the first birds stirred. The children slept through the clatter of the pump and the creak of the stove, their breathing steady in the loft above. Outside, the garden rows had begun to green with promised squash, beans, and early lettuce curling up toward the light. Yate came in with his boots damp from dew, a pair of eggs cupped in one hand and a quiet look on his face. He set them on the table, brushing his hat against his thigh before hanging it by the door. "She's laying regular now," he said. "That red hen, the mean one, chased me halfway across the yard." Pearl poured him coffee into a dented tin cup. "She pecks Owen, too. He says she's got murder in her eyes." He took the cup, chuckling low. "We all got a little of that some days." Pearl leaned back against the counter, apron still damp along the hem. "I've been thinking about the barn." "What about it?" "It's leaning too far on the north side. The beams under the hayloft are soft. If it rains hard, we'll have a mess." Yate nodded slowly. "I can fix it. Might need to bring in help for the heavier timber. I'll ask Miss Weller if her boy's strong enough. He's been helping at the church since spring." "That's a good idea," Yate said, and then added, "You've got a way of seeing things clear." Pearl folded the rag in her hands. "When you spend years watching everything fall apart, you learn where the cracks start." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and touched her wrist. "This place hasn't cracked once since you came." She didn't pull away. Later that day, Owen helped Yate hitch the wagon while Pearl and Orla sorted seed potatoes behind the cabin. The girl hummed under her breath, a tune she'd likely picked up from the schoolhouse, and Pearl worked in silence, watching the shadow of the mountain shift across the earth as the sun climbed. "Mama," Orla said, holding up a sprout, "this one's got a little root already." "Can I plant it?" "You can," Pearl said, "but dig deep. The soil's been dry this week." They worked until the light turned golden and the air filled with the smell of cut hay drifting from the lowland fields. Pearl washed at the basin, her arms streaked with dirt, and watched Yate lift Orla up onto the mare, his hands sure and gentle. Owen led them in slow circles, teaching her balance, and the girl's laughter carried across the yard. Pearl turned back to the cabin and stepped inside. The table was laid with a plate of cornbread, a pot of beans still warm from the fire, and a small piece of cloth folded neatly beside her place. She opened it and found a hair ribbon, soft blue, the kind she hadn't worn since she was a girl. She turned as Yate came in. "You left this," she said, holding it up. "I found it at the general store in town, thought it'd suit you." She looked at the ribbon, then back at him. "I haven't worn anything like this in 20 years. "Then it's time you did." Pearl didn't answer. She crossed to the washstand, dipped her hands again, and twisted her hair up, tucking the ribbon through the knot without looking in the mirror. When she turned, Yate was still watching her. "You were beautiful when I was 18, he said quietly, "but you're more now. You're real." She walked to him, stopping just close enough to feel the heat of his breath. "You've built something here, Yate. You gave us space. But what I didn't expect was how easy it was to let you in. I never wanted to take space you weren't ready to give." Pearl touched his chest, her palm resting over the rhythm of his heart. "You didn't take it. You earned it." He leaned in, brushing his lips against her brow, then her cheek. She met him fully, without hesitation. The kiss was tender, not rushed, and it tasted of everything they had weathered: wind, worry, and the long ache of waiting. When they pulled apart, Pearl rested her head against his shoulder. "We're not the same people we were under those cottonwoods." "No," he said, "but I think we're better." That night the four of them sat beneath the stars, a quilt spread over the dry grass. Orla counted constellations while Owen carved a whistle from a thin branch. Pearl leaned against Yate's side, her hand woven with his, and the fire crackled low beside them. "What do you want from tomorrow?" she asked softly. He looked up at the sky. "More of this. Work quiet, your hand in mine. Maybe a few sheep. Sheep. They don't argue like chickens." Pearl laughed, and the sound didn't carry pain anymore. "Then we'll get sheep." The moon rose slow and full over the ridge, casting silver light across the fields. The cabin behind them stood strong and still, and the land held a hush that spoke of roots deepening, not just in soil but in hearts. They had come from ruin and doubt, from long years lived without rest. But now they had something built not from the past, but from the steadiness of each new day. Pearl and Yate lay side by side beneath the stars, their fingers laced, the children safe in their beds, the earth ready for whatever came next. And for the first time in either of their lives, the future no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like home.